and welcome back to Love Your Food. This week we have sort of a basic recipe for you. I hesitate to call it quick because it's not super fast, but this is a Blitz puff pastry. So puff pastry is rather complicated to make. This is a shorter and easier way to make it, although it does still take rather a lot of time. It's a little tricky, but much easier than standard puff. So our ingredients are, we're starting with some flour, we have some softened butter, and we have some butter that is going to be cold, as well as a little bit of salt, and some very cold water. We need ice water for this. One of the tricks to this recipe is we want to keep our ingredients as cold as possible, most of our ingredients as cold as possible for most of the process. So we're going to start by taking our cold butter. Now we let this sit out for a little while. You can see it's not super cold. It's still soft enough that it's breaking on the knife. But we want to break this into small pieces. We want to ideally cube it, but I mean, it's going into this recipe. It doesn't matter if it's all exactly cubes. We just want to break it into small pieces. So we're going to cut it into sticks. And again, don't worry if they break because we're going to cut it into cubes after this. And if it's just small pieces, that's fine too. We let this get a little bit warm before we handled it. And then we're just going to cut that into smaller bits, into cubes, rough cubes, as I'm sure you can see here. And then we're going to put these actually in the freezer. We're going to get these nice and cold. We want to make sure they're firm and solid when we go to use them. So here's our butter. A lot of butter in this recipe. It's obviously puff pastry. It's very rich. So we're just going to get that into a bowl, and we're going to cover that and put it into the fridge or even the freezer. We want to make sure these are nice and firm when we go to use them. Don't worry if they're sticking together a little bit. When they're in little pieces like this, once they're cold, it'll be much easier to break them apart. So off those go to the fridge. In the meantime, while that is cooling, actually best to start this once it is close to being ready. Once the cold butter is close to being ready, we're going to add some salt to the butter and add our flour. So we're going to get this portion of the dough started here. Now, puff pastry, unlike something like croissant dough, is not a leavened dough. There's no yeast or anything like that in this. It is just flour, salt, and butter. The puffing of it comes from the water trapped in the butter escaping and making little steam pockets in the pastry, which is why we do need to work this quite a lot, because it does need some gluten development in order to keep those little pockets and give it that flaky, light texture. So we're going to start moving this, pulsing it, and getting the butter and the flour mixed in with some of the ice cold water. And again, you want to use that nice cold water in this so it doesn't cause the butter to melt or soften. So once you get to about this stage, it's about ready to start mixing in water a little bit at a time until it comes together. So just give it a little scrape down. If you can see to the bottom, you can see that there's no little clumps or pockets at the bottom, then just keep going. And we're going to start adding water slowly, a little bit at a time, and you'll see it start to come together. And it happens actually quite quickly. So you can see after that last bit of water, those little shreds started to come together quite quickly. A little bit more water, and before you know it, you'll find that everything's rapidly coming together into big clumps like this. And this is pretty much where we want this dough to start. So once it gets to about this stage, the dough has come together into a sort of a shaggy dough. We are ready to roll this and introduce our nice ice cold butter to start making our layers. So we're just going to give this a little mush down on a cutting board here. Now ours came out a little bit dry. The amount of water you use will really depend on your flour. It'll depend on the environment. It'll depend on how dry the room is, all those sort of things. Ours came out honestly a little bit dry, so we added water throughout the process because it seemed a little underhydrated all the way through. Now, you don't have to really worry about overworking this dough because you do want a lot of gluten development. That's part of the how this dough works is you want it to be able to stretch without breaking. You want it to hold those little puffs of steam that come off of the butter as it cooks. So you do need some gluten development. Don't worry about working it too much. And we are going to be obviously rolling and folding this several times. So once you've got it into sort of a rough rectangle, now you can start putting in some of that ice cold, nice firm butter and just pushing it right into the dough. Now we folded that over once, spread it out a little bit, and added the rest of the butter on top. And you just want to try and incorporate it. This is the sort of the cheater part. This is the part that's a little bit easier than regular puff, because some of your butter is going to show up on the outside. Some of your butter is going to be visible from the outside. If it were regular puff pastry, that would be a disaster. In this, it's totally expected, and it's fine. Don't worry, we're gonna correct for that with our multiple foldings, and it'll get those layers in there. So now we've got most of our butter concealed inside there, but we've worked it quite a bit, and it needs to be really cold before we can work it again. So we're going to wrap this up. You're going to put it on a tray so that it lays nice and flat. Try and keep it in a rectangular shape if you can. We're just going to wrap this up in some plastic wrap, and this is going to go into the freezer for a little while until it's nice and cold. Now you can do this in the fridge or the freezer. Fridge if you're fine with it taking a little bit longer. Freezer if you want it to be on a little shorter time span. So letting it rest like this does a couple of things. It lets the dough relax a little bit, but it also helps it sort of hydrolyze. The liquid passes through or gets absorbed into the flour a little bit better. And it makes it a little bit easier to work with, although it will be hard off the bat when you first put it down, because it's very, very cold. It's mostly made of butter. So here it is, fresh out of the cold place that you've had it. And you can see it's pretty much a solid slab. Now this is going to take a little bit of time to work. So we recommend to start off, of course, give it a little bit of flour because you don't want it to stick. Then get your rolling pin and give it a little bash. Like just smash it a little bit to soften it up. Let it get it moving a little bit, and then we're going to roll this out. Now, this is the part where we're going to start doing our layers, and we're going to do this several times. So this is our first time. You can still see large chunks of butter on the surface of the dough. It is pretty tough. Again, we did find that I think our dough was quite dry, so it ended up being a little bit tough all the way through, a little bit dry. So each time we folded, we did try to introduce a little bit more water, just so that it would be a little bit more hydrated all the way through the process. So you can see here, despite the flour, some of the butter did come through. This is pretty normal in this first folding, so don't worry about that. It's going to all end up inside. Now, if you do have some that's on the outside, like this piece, do try and get a little bit of flour or some dough on the outside just to cover it as best you can. So we're just going to cover that with a little bit of flour, make sure it doesn't stick too bad. And then give everything a nice push down together. Make sure you keep your surfaces well floured so that nothing sticks. And let's get ready to roll this a little bit more. Again, any butter that you see on the outside, feel free to just douse that in flour to make sure it's covered. We're just going to roll this until it's nicely pressed together. And we're going to give this one more fold before we put it back in the fridge. And we're going to do this twice. Now, this all takes place on the day that you're making the dough. So we're going to do this one more time on the same day, usually an hour and a half, 2 hours between rollings. And then the last time we do this is going to be the day we're using the dough. So we made this a day in advance, and then the next day we used it. So we rolled it twice today. This was the first rolling. And again, try to keep it in that nice rectangular shape. It really makes it easier when you're trying to roll it out if it's already in the shape you want it to be. So we're just going to wrap this back up, and into the fridge it goes. And again, let's just keep it on that sheet pan to make sure it stays flat, and that makes it super easy to work with. And then here we go again. So we've taken it out of the fridge. We've got our nice floured cutting board here, or pastry board, I should say. And here's our nice firm and cold dough. So all of the butter in there is nice and firm. And again, just grab that rolling pin once you've given it a little bit of flour. And give it a little bash, and we're going to roll this out again. Now the rolling really is, this is where we're getting all of those amazing layers. So the butter is going to get trapped in smaller and smaller pieces in between the layers as we roll this out and fold it and roll it out and fold it. So this does take some time. It's still a little easier than full-on puff pastry. Now here we're adding just a little bit of water. As I said, we found that our dough, our flour may have been a little bit dry. So we're just trying to add a little bit of water on each of these folds to add a little bit of hydration to the puff pastry. And you can see it's starting to get that nice smooth exterior. The gluten is really holding it together. It is starting to get some really nice texture to it. And we're going to give it a second rolling right away. So each time we do this, we're going to do it twice. And each time that happens, it's a 3-fold. You can also do a 4-fold if you can get it small enough or thin enough. So we're just going to make sure everything is well floured. And here we go again. One more roll on this fold. A little bit of water in there as well. Now do try to be aware of your dough. If you don't feel like it's too dry, then you may not need to add water. Ours felt very, very dry. It was a little bit more stiff than we wanted, so we really needed to add a little bit of water on each of those folds. And we're just going to get it back in our plastic wrap. Try to recycle if you can. It doesn't. It's the same lump of dough, so you can just wrap it in the same plastic wrap over and over again. That's fine. And once again, this is going to go into the fridge. And that's it for the first day. So we're done for day one of the folding and everything. And then the next day we're going to get this out, and this is now we're getting ready to use it. So we're going to spread this out nice and thin. Now the recipe we're using it for was sort of an experiment. We had never done beef Wellington before, so we wanted to give it a try. We're not going to do a video on this iteration of beef Wellington. It was sort of an experiment, and we learned a few things, so we'll do a video on beef Wellington a little bit later on. So now we're going to cut it off. We only need a little bit of this because we're only making 3 servings of this beef Wellington we made. So we're only going to take a third of this dough. And you can see some of those layers in there as I get in a little bit closer. So there's those beautiful layers. That's what's going to cause the puffing once we've got this in the oven. So the other 2 portions that we let aside, those are going to go back in the fridge or in the freezer. It stores in the freezer very, very easily, and you can use it again in the future. We will have a recipe using another section of this coming up soon. In the meantime, so to get this ready for our beef Wellingtons, we are going to give it a good stretch out, and we want to get it nice and thin. And here we go. We're just going to wrap it up in this. Now again, this isn't a video about the beef Wellington, so we will do a video on that in the future, but this one I'm just trying to focus on the puff pastry. And then the nice thing is you can just seal this closed with a little bit of egg wash. And your egg wash should just be whatever your standard egg wash is, just an egg, even a little bit of water in there. And that'll seal up really, really nicely. And you can see it's nice and stretchy, so we're just getting a little bit of that egg wash on the top part. We're going to stretch that bottom bit up, and it's going to cling pretty nicely. It's going to seal up very, very well. Now we have little bits of mushroom sort of on the outside there because we chopped the mushrooms and they were on the cutting board. And unfortunately, that does mar the look a little bit, but I mean, it's all part of the same dish, so it's fine. So once we've got our little beef Wellington packages ready, we're going to give a little egg wash on the top as well. And then we're just going to give a little tiny score across the top. We want to give it a little bit of space to expand. You don't want it to be too deep, but you do want to cut into it a little bit. And that'll keep it from breaking as it expands. And this is what it looks like when it comes out. You can see those beautiful layers in that score we made on top. You got that nice color. It's very nice and flaky. As you can see, it's super crusty and really, really nice and crisp all the way through. Now this is a beef Wellington dish, obviously, so the pastry on the sides and bottom have obviously absorbed a lot of that, the juices from the beef and that duxelle sauce we made. So it looks a little bit doughy, but it actually came out really nice and light. It was very, very puffy, beautiful and crispy on top. And this is, as I said, sort of the shortcut to puff pastry. Still does take a little bit of time. It's a little bit labor intensive, but really, really nice to make your own puff pastry. So we hope you'll try this Blitz puff and try some new things with it. So if you like this recipe, please do like and subscribe. And if you have any recipes you'd like to see Chef Caleb try on the channel, please let us know in the comments below. And remember to love your food.